Hi, everyone. Apologies
Uh-oh.
for a few minutes delay here. Ken, I heard an uh-oh. Is everything okay?
Just gonna switch. Technical problems.
Beautiful. Yeah, Mighty Networks is a little bit annoying with sharing links outside of the community. So anyway, glad we got that resolved. Ken, so let's dive right in. We chatted for the first time a few weeks ago. I read your book. I heard your podcast. Heard your talk from I think a few years ago at this point. But I think we want to spend as much time as possible sort of forward looking and not having you recount the book for the umpteenth time, but just as setting the frame, setting the context. Why don't you kind of start with why objectives might be, why we should question them, and why they might be especially dangerous when it comes to innovative and ambitious ideas? Why don't we start there?
Sure, yeah. So hopefully not too redundant for those who've heard this a few times or read it maybe in the past, but the reason that we wrote this book about how having an objective can be harmful to actually achieving something is because of this observation that when you have an ambitious objective, this often can be deceptive. So it's really deception that's the problem. And it's really about ambitious objectives. So as we've conceded and tried to make clear, like nobody's against having like modest objectives. Those do work. People should continue to implement their modest objectives. But when it comes to really ambitious objectives, the real problem is that there's a series of steps that you need to go through to get to where you want to go. That's your objective. And we're saying it's ambitious because it's hard. Like otherwise it wouldn't make sense to call it ambitious. It was easy, then you would just do it. So this is by definition hard, kind of a truism. So you have a hard objective. That means you don't know what all the stepping stones are to get there. There's this path you need to follow. And so, again, if you did know what the stepping stones were, then it wouldn't be a hard problem. So you must not know all of them. So that means that there's this series of like sort of intermediate states you have to go through that you don't know what they are that are going to lead you to this thing. And so when you set an objective, you generally will now measure progress against it by somehow with some kind of metric that will tell you how close am I to the thing that I'm trying to get to. But the problem is that the stepping stones, the things that you need to go through to get to the objective, they almost certainly don't look like the objective itself. Because again, if they did look like the objective, then you would just go through them. I mean, it would be obvious. So there are things that are surprising. Like that's almost always true. That's why discovery is so interesting. Like you go through surprises. It's like, wow, this leads to this. Who would have ever thought that? So that's almost surely the case if you have something ambitious you're trying to do. But by setting the objective, you're almost ensuring that you won't register, recognize, understand those surprising things because they don't look like the thing that you're measuring, which is the objective. And so this is hence the problem. And so it actually makes it harder to achieve the objective, but also just generally achieve anything ambitious. Because the problem is that now that you're focused on this metric, which is this objective, this one singular objective, which you care about, you're going to be blinded to all the other things you might be able to accomplish. Like if you have a bunch of stepping stones that you're going through, like things that you're doing, but you don't think of them as on the path to your objective, you're likely to dismiss them, ignore them, and throw them away because they don't seem to lead to the thing that you care about, even though they could lead to other things that you might care about, but you're not admitting those because they're not the objective that you actually care about. So you're really closing yourself off to all kinds of achievement, the objective itself, as well as all these other things that you might achieve if you weren't so myopic about your objective.
Thank you. And just for I guess like syntax to make sure I really understand it. Can you talk really quickly about deception? You kind of write that it's the ultimate false compass, and stepping stone I think is like a very clear metaphor, but would love to hear maybe like double click on that for just a second. How do you think of a stepping stone? Is it super obvious what that next step is? Is it sometimes unclear? If you could dive into those two things, that'd be great.
Oh yeah, thanks. That's helpful to get it. Make sure that the vocabulary is not misleading or confusing. Because I come from computer science and artificial intelligence, and some of these are just like jargon words. Like deception's a common word, like in AI, but it's not like it doesn't necessarily mean exactly the same thing in like regular speaking. So like, what is deception? What am I talking about in this case? Basically, it really is a simple idea. But I don't mean when somebody's trying to trick you. That's not what I mean. But what it means is basically that it appears to you that you're moving in the right direction, but you're actually heading towards a brick wall. That's a deceptive situation. There's also the converse of that, which is that you appear to be going in the wrong direction, but actually it would be correct if you would just continue along that path. Both of those are deceptive situations. So the more, I think the more kind of a threatening one when it comes to ambitious objectives is the latter, where it looks like things are going wrong, but they're actually not. So basically you're going along some path and you get some weird result, and it looks to you like this has nothing to do with what I actually want to do with my life. And so you say, I'm not going to go down this path any further. Like, I don't think I should pursue this. That's deception if actually that is what you needed. But the problem is that it looks like it isn't because it's deceptive. And the problem here is that, like, every interesting thing you ever want to do will be deceptive. That's why they're interesting. Like, there's a surprise along the way, or else it wouldn't be interesting. You would know exactly what you need to do, then there's no problem. So the things that are like challenges are always going to be deceptive. And so you're always going to end up on some stepping stone that looks like it's not the right thing. And then you're going to be inclined to dismiss it, which is kind of like a tragic thing if you really care about that objective. And so deception is just like ubiquitous across search spaces, which means like places where you might be looking to achieve something. And it doesn't mean that you need to become better at somehow like defending yourself against deception, like, because that's basically impossible. Like, there's no way to know what leads to what. Like, we just don't know. That's why these things are hard. What it does mean is that you just have to be more open-minded about potentially going somewhere else. It's like you see something, this looks interesting to you, but in your assessment, it's like wrong for your objective, so you throw it away. That's a big mistake. If you think it's interesting, it might not lead to your objective, but it might lead to something else that's really great. And you just threw it away. And that's, I think, what we tend to do in our cultures. We throw away all these deceptive stepping stones because we think they're not leading in the right direction.
So Ken, in that vein, two things that struck me reading your book is one, if you let go of achieving a particular great thing, you're more likely to achieve something great. Now, it might not be what you want or what you predicted, but more likely. And then, is it right to think of following your interests as the right compass, right? And in your case, tell me if I'm misremembering, but the most interesting thing opens up other interesting things, right? So it sort of becomes this like fractal nature almost, where you open up a lot of doors. Can you talk to us a little bit about like changing our compass from one of objectives and sort of, I will achieve this by this date, versus following your interest? Because like it's such a, from like a Western mindset, it's such a different way to approach problems.
Yeah. So that this idea of following your interest and the idea of being able to achieve something but not a particular thing follows directly from what I said about deception. So it's a really logical leap. Like, it's not, as in, I like to say it's logical because it's not like a new age kind of philosophy or something, at least the way I'm presenting. Like, you could imagine somebody saying, let's just all do whatever we want. We're going to have a good time and life will work out. That sound might be pleasing sounding to some, to others not, but that's not the point though. Like, this is actually a logical thing. This comes from scientific experiments. So if you think about the point about deception, look, you have a problem, which is that the things that lead to where you want to go don't resemble where you want to go. And this is like a fundamental aspect of like all complex spaces. And so like, you're not going to know when you cross that stepping stone, which means you can't plan properly. Like, you don't know what to plan for. And so like, it leads to something that many people initially find depressing, but I think is actually liberating, which is this realization that there's no way to make a confident striving in a particular direction. Like, you cannot ensure that you're going to get to a particular place in life. It's just, there's no formula for that. Again, unless it's modest things we can do. But if you want to be ambitious. And so that's like, at first that's depressing because, we feel like unanchored. Like, well, what can I do then? Like, you're telling me I can't like actually plan for anything. But see, the thing that goes along with that, the corollary, is like actually really interesting and liberating, which is the idea that, but what you can do is increase the probability that something good will happen. It's just not a particular good thing. And so that's like intuitively kind of hard to grasp at first. Like, what does that actually mean? Like, I can actually be good at causing something good, but not actually some particular thing. But if you just think about it, there's tons of opportunities out there, like in your life in general, for our society, for institutions. There's all these opportunities out there. It's not like there's a shortage of possible things we could achieve. And what we don't know is that we don't know the path to any particular one of them. But if you have a mindset, and interestingness comes into this, where you're willing to collect stepping stones because they're interesting, you're increasing the probability that you're going to follow a path to one of those things. We just don't know which one, but all of them are worthy things to achieve. It's just not something you knew that you were going towards. And so now the interesting comes in because like the question then is, what you really should be doing if you want to achieve something ambitious is maximizing the amount of jumping off points that you have towards things that are actually interesting. And of course, it's almost like circular, but the things that lead to interesting things are interesting things. So like if you encounter something interesting, that leads to other interesting things. So if you're a collector of interesting things, what I was calling like in the book, like a treasure hunter, like you just collect things that are interesting. That's like a repertoire, or it's like an archive of stuff that you can use to jump off from to get to other interesting things in the future. And eventually some of those are going to pay off. You just don't know which and where. You don't know what it's going to be in the end. But so I think that when it comes to like really high achievement, like think people doing remarkable things, that's the kind of attitude that they have, which is they're basically opportunistic. It's like, well, I was going down here, but then I saw something interesting over there. That's no problem. I'll just take that also. It's not like you can't do more than one thing at a time in life. I mean, you can have more than one thing going on. That's true too. So it's not as dismal as like you're just following some like extremely risky path and that's the only path. And I mean, you can live life like that, but you don't have to live life like that. So it's more that let's keep a lot of things around that are opportunities. And follow several of them, like probably simultaneously, because the downside of it is that there's risk. And so like with ambition comes risk. If you want to achieve something ambitious, you might fail. And so that has to be, taken into account. And you also have a right to not do it. Like you could just say, I'm not going to be ambitious. And you can do things that are modest, and just be perfectly happy. So there's nothing wrong with that. But this is about if you want to achieve things that would be considered to be remarkable, not necessarily by other people, but by you. Like if they would be something that would make you feel like you did something really amazing.
Mm. It strikes me that it feels like a very artistic way to live life, in the sense that, like, I think if you're authentic with it, the things that interest you, there will of course be overlap with others, but like the very pointy specific things that really catch you are probably, that overlap is probably quite different than most people, right? So it's really interesting. Like again, like this fractal idea comes to mind, where like the overlap of tennis and mental models and startups and whatever, like it's
Yeah.
probably relatively unique to me, right? Just to put myself at the center of it for a second. So Ken, I think that's a great frame and jumping off point. Kind of covers the main arguments, if you will, at least some of them from the book. If we kind of move forward looking, let's start with, I guess, has anything major changed since you published the book? Whether that is new findings or good pushback you've gotten or surprising results. Anything there spark anything you'd want to dive into?
Yeah, let's see. I did want to just say something on that point about art, because I do think I totally agree with that. I think that's a really good insight. That like the you said, it's kind of artistic. It's true that I keep running into art, and like at different levels. Like at one point I actually spoke to the Rhode Island School of Design, which is basically like an art school. And I have to say that was like one of the most emotional of all the times I've ever spoken about this. And I've spoken about it a lot. The artists like really, really got it. And it strongly resonated with them. And it was like cathartic for them. Because like for them, they were basically like, this is what I do, but I can't justify it to anybody, which is like this dilemma of the artist. Like, it's like my parents don't understand, why are you doing this? Like my teachers don't understand, why are you doing this? Like I'm constantly trying to justify my choices. And this like kind of captures in some way like why this is justifiable. They're doing things because they're interesting, not because there's some metric that says, well, yeah, if you like bash this piece of iron onto a piece of glass, like this is like a good thing to do that's going to help somebody. Just that's interesting to me. And I met a guy like that who's doing stuff like that, at that school. So that really made an impression on me, like how the artists responded. And I've also thought that like in science, especially artificial intelligence, that we should admit that there's actually a very artistic aspect to what's going on, and that might change some of the dialogue. Okay, but that's actually not your question. So you're asking
it's great though. Thank you for that.
You're asking about like what has changed since the book, and that's 7 years basically. And there's been things that have changed, like in the field of machine learning, where I mostly work, and that like build on, well, there are algorithmic principles. Like it's funny, the book is really unusual, and that it's basically saying like it came originally from algorithmic principles, and then they extended to like life principles. It's like almost never happens. It's like, oh boy, my algorithm helped me to understand my life better. Like computer scientists don't talk like that. And actually take a lot of pleasure in that. Like that's just been super fulfilling to see an algorithm actually like give people make people feel good about themselves. It's very unusual. But when I think about that, something I've thought, maybe someone new over the last several years, is that in some way that should happen in artificial intelligence. Like if you think about this field, like this is about intelligence. Intelligence is obviously a natural phenomenon, which is an aspect of human nature. Basically, is in some ways it is what it means to be human. Like intelligence encompasses, it's not just like you're a human calculator, like there's like a bunch of arithmetic, like it's everything that you do, which is about human nature. And so it kind of makes sense. Like if we're trying to reproduce human nature in a computer, it should have insights that feed back, shouldn't it? If you ever hit on something deep, it should tell us something about ourselves, I would think. And so I kind of think that's a yardstick for AI that is very little discussed, but deserves, like it really should be, and that's kind of a result. So it's funny because it does come from these algorithmic principles, like it feeds back into AI, and there certainly in the last 7 years you see change and progress. Like one of the biggest things I think, which does relate to what people say even outside of AI, is this kind of idea that people become uneasy about the suggestion of randomness in life. And also in algorithms. And so like the book, and in general, this philosophy recommends something like pursuing interestingness, which is very related to pursuing novelty. And this makes people very uncomfortable because they're like, well, but if I pursue novelty, basically I'm living randomly. Like I don't have any goal. So I'm like, I just do this, I'll do that. There's no principle that I'm following and so forth. And I really try to argue strongly that this is not novelty and interesting are not random. They're completely different from randomness. Randomness is here's 5 things I can do. I'll just like roll a die and just like decide what to do. Like that's not what we're talking about here. This is like very principled based on information. Like you decide what's interesting based on your entire life experience. Is anything but random. And novelty is also like that. Like you're comparing where you are to where you've been. So you have a real metric there that you're actually using to guide you and point you in directions. But of course, like this also comes up in the field as well, because we have algorithms like novelty search, which reflect this philosophy, but in terms of like AI. And in those, like, there's been a lot of like attempts to reintroduce objective notions. So where can that happen? Can that, like, I have certain things that I care about in life, and I want those to be prioritized. I don't just want to follow novelty. And I think you see more sophistication there over like the preceding years of like how can we incorporate these notions without destroying the ability to navigate freely, which is really the primary thing here. Like you cannot, if you destroy the ability to follow interestingness, you've destroyed everything. Like you can't actually succeed anymore. And so like if you reintroduce anything objective into this kind of style, you have to be very careful about it, because the objectives tend to be like a poison pill that will like ruin the pursuit of interestingness. So there's a lot of like sophisticated ideas about like how these things can align in a way that's very careful and delicate.
There's, I think I heard E.O. Wilson talk about this the most, but kind of this biological principle of explore, exploit, right? Like when your environment is very safe, it makes sense to exploit it, right? You have no predators, there's a water source, you keep going back, you keep going back, you keep going back. But if there's a lot of novelty, the explore mindset makes a lot more sense. And it feels like there's some interesting parallel there sort of between what you're saying and that biological principle. Yeah, if there's anything you want to add on there, but I have a finer question to post on that after.
Yeah, let me add something to that, because that actually that's a metaphor that a lot of people bring up. That like this reminds me of exploitation versus exploration, which certainly in computer science is brought up all the time. But I think even outside computer science, people talk about this, like this trade-off or dichotomy between explore and exploit. And I actually don't prefer that for this. It's fun. It's funny because I guess hopefully it's not too hair splitting, but the thing is that I think what explore and exploit, when people talk about that, what they mean is that exploit means following a principle. It's like, I know that this kind of thing increases this metric, so I'm going to go in that direction. Whereas explore generally means having no principle at all. It's like, I'm just going to do stuff that's crazy, but like maybe hopefully if I'm lucky, I'll just like hit on something useful and then I can start exploiting it. But I think that that's not actually what I'm describing, because like what's different here is that novelty and interestingness are principles. So to me, they don't actually look like what people usually mean by explore, because explore is almost like this almost it's like this kind of like dirty indulgence. It's like, well, I'll just do it like when I get a little extra time on my hands. Like I really shouldn't be doing this, but it's something I'm going to do. But it's actually like like I think that pursuing interestingness is actually a form of exploitation, not exploration, because like you're using information, actually very rich information, which I would argue is more rich than what you do when you exploit. Because exploit tends to be like a very, very impoverished type of activity. Like you have like this one metric. It's like, how fast is my robot running or something? It's like this one thing. And so it's very easy to follow, but it's not rich. Whereas interestingness is about like thousands of things all at the same time. Like what makes a picture interesting to you? It's very rich. It's very complex. High dimensional is what like a computer scientist would say. There's many dimensions to it. And so, so I think like you're basically, when you're, what we're calling exploring in this kind of sense is actually this high dimensional exploitation, actually. It's the exploitation of interestingness, which is, or novelty, which are very principled and they are information dense. And so I think that the metaphor makes it sound like something, like to most people that it isn't. It's actually just as principled as exploiting, and it's actually a form of exploitation. It's just a different kind of information that's being exploited in this case.
Super helpful. Thank you for refining that. Ken, one or a couple of things that sparked in me when I was reading your book is like, yeah, I think Paul Graham made it famous that most startups look like toys at the beginning, right? It's something really simple. People make fun of it. That's never going to become anything, but they're following their interests, if you will. So, just like, again, pulling from startups, pulling from biology, it's really interesting to see how much this seems to tie together. One thing I'd love to get your perspective on is how you think about intuition in this space. Like, is following your intuition and your gut the same as novelty? And related to that, can we refine what is interesting to us to become better and better, right? So like if we're broadly saying follow something novel, follow something interesting, can we refine that compass somehow to kind of give us a better idea what the most opportune stepping stones are moving forward?
Yeah, so I think intuition is basically the same as following interestingness. I would say it's a principled thing to do for sure. It's a scary thing because one reason that we really like objectives is because we can do an assessment which can tell you whether you're actually improving with respect to your objective or not. We love that. That I think of as a security blanket. So it's like, your boss wants to know, well, how do I know you're making progress? And I've got a metric here. I wrote my OKRs or something, and here's a metric, and I can tell you they're making progress. And so that's a security blanket. It makes you feel like you're measuring something. Intuition, on the other hand, is dangerous and can't be measured in general. And so people think of it as unprincipled. It's like, well, let me just tell you, I just feel really good about this. Like, will your boss accept that? If you tell your boss, well, I really feel like this is the right thing to do. I can't measure it at all. And a lot of people don't like that. But the thing is, if you think about it, intuition is a reflection of your life history. It's not like you were just born yesterday and you just have like these random intuitions. Like, you built up those intuitions over an entire lifetime. And so they really can compete with these metrics. The metrics are like ridiculously naive in some ways, because they're usually like one dimensional, like something like speed or performance, or it's like very easy. So I wonder sometimes, like, okay, we're trying to innovate, because innovation is ambitious. Like, if we're not trying to innovate, this might not be so true if we're just doing something modest. But if we're trying to innovate and we're in a company or something, so it's something really ambitious, then like we say, well, okay, but we have to have a metric and we're going to follow this metric. Well, but the thing is that, like, why do we have all these like high paid people to do that? Because like the thing is, like, anybody can just measure this metric. It's like, how fast did it go? How much energy did it consume? How many people bought the product? Like, I mean, like, you don't need a PhD, like, or like, you don't need a business degree to know these kinds of things. Like, anybody can measure, and then criticize you. It's like, oh, the metric didn't go up. Like, well, why do we have these educated people? Like, the reason you have education, the reason that we invested in you for like 25, 30 years, like a lot of people through public education. I mean, I emphasize that because we're talking millions of dollars have probably been spent, like, to get you to where you are. And they're basically saying, well, screw your intuitions. We don't have any interest in them at all. Like, after investing all that time, what the heck were we just building up? Just so you can tell us whether the metric is going up, where you don't need any education at all. It could be like in 6th grade education to do that. It's in the intuitions that the value of everything that you've ever experienced are actually reflected, I think. And so those are extremely valuable, and they relate to what you find interesting. It's just that it's harder to justify them in an objective manner, but that's a reason to be skeptical about objectives, not a reason to be skeptical about intuition. I think
Mm.
almost every great insight that anybody's ever had was because they had a good intuition. It wasn't because like some metric was there. That's where all the value is coming from. So certainly I endorse intuition and think it's basically what you have a right to follow, and sort of the shock or the change that this perspective gives you is to be justified in doing it. Like it's principle. It's not like you're doing this like indulgence, like you shouldn't really be doing following your intuitions, but you've got a little time on the side, so you just see what happens and peek ahead. Like, no, you should be doing that. It's completely principled. I mean, assuming you're interested in something ambitious, follow your interest in your intuition. So for sure. Okay, that was a long answer to the first part.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, and just
Yeah.
a refresh, like, can we hone that intuition, that North Star over time somehow?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, of course. I think you can hone it. You're just by living, you're updating your intuitions. And in fact, like something I haven't really delved into yet, which is that like what actually constitutes interestingness is that a huge component of it is novelty. Like I would say that like it's not the case that everything that's novel is interesting. Like there are some novel things that are not interesting, but the other way around is always the case. So basically everything that's interesting is novel.
Mm.
Like if there's something that's not novel, it's not interesting either. You know, it's like, for example, like cars were once interesting, but they're not now. It's like the idea of a car. You know, it's like I tell you, like, I've got this cool thing. Let's talk about it. Like it's kind of like a box on wheels as it goes by itself. It's like, can you imagine? This is just not interesting at all. But of course it was super interesting 100 years ago or something, or more than that. Like, so it changes with novelty. Novelty is very instrumental. And because of that, you have to, if you're going to stay on the cutting edge of interestingness, and this can be personal, what you find interesting doesn't have to be what I find interesting, but whatever it is, you're going to have to be very attuned to what's novel now, as opposed to what was novel 20 years ago. And I think this is often why, you know, people fall off their game who were like really astute at a certain point in time, because, you know, it's hard to keep on that cutting edge. It's because it basically requires you to constantly be absorbing like what is at the cutting edge. So you can judge what's novel now as opposed to 20 years ago. And that will feed into your intuitions, you know, like understanding like the current churn of everything and the richness of everything that's going on right now. And of course, it's not only about novelty, like you can refine your sense of the interesting. It might be with respect to a category that you're interested in. Like I'm interested in AI. So I'm constantly like refining what I think is interesting within AI. You may be interested in something completely different, but you know, you'll become a connoisseur the more you kind of consume and understand that area. And it'll be something I couldn't touch at all, like from my experience. So everybody has a unique intuition that they're constantly refining, and probably on multiple different topics. And by all means, like that's the way that you get good at pursuing these stepping stones and treasure hunting and so forth.
Have you found a way to spot those who are doing that? Is there any way to sort of tell who sort of, I think you say in the book, those who are like
Mm,
one in the shadows almost, right? Like one step away from like that stepping
mm,
stone. Have you found a way to kind of tease that out of people or spot that somehow?
mm.
If
That
not,
is a
let's move
unique
on. But
question. I like that question. That I haven't had that question very often. Um, so I think that would be worth thinking about, actually. Like, it's someone just asked, I saw the chat just flew by, but I saw somebody was asking something related about how do I decide who's on my research team? Well, if I could spot these qualities, then that would help me decide who should be on my research team. I mean, I want to acknowledge that that's not always the case. Like sometimes, you know, you can be useful without being good at this. Like that's true. Like if I just give you an assignment and it's very well defined, that's basically objective based, and it isn't deceptive, like it's basically not super ambitious, then you can just do that. And that can be very useful for me, for you, for everybody. So it's not like everybody has to always, and even on a research team, that's true. Like sometimes, you know, if I'm being very visionary, like maybe I don't want everyone to be super visionary on the team, because like we're just going to get into conflict. Like they want to go this way, I want to go that way. It's like, well, maybe I should just get people who are more just want to follow instructions. And so it's not always the case that you want someone like this. But nevertheless, I think the people who are going to shine the most and be absolutely outstanding, and it's certainly people we want to get into research or any other innovative industries, like we want to identify them. That's true, because it's kind of a tragedy if there's somebody like that and they basically can't get into school or they can't get into the company or whatever it is, because we don't know how to identify people like that. So we do want to be able to find those people and promote them and basically educate them so that they have a chance to express those talents. And so what is it that allows us to identify people like that? And I think it's like way, way far away from current, assessment techniques. What do we have now? We have things like the SAT test, grades, we have some things like an essay, you send in an essay to get into college. Grad school has similar things like GRE. And I think that's just not really that related to what we should ask. So what should we be asking? I've thought about this a bit. I think these are kind of weird things, but I would ask some questions of people. The problem is honesty, but let's put honesty aside. I'm not sure like what to do about the fact that we could lie, but I'd like to ask people something like, have you ever written like a story without anybody telling you to do that? Like when and how many, and when did you start? Have you ever written a program that we weren't assigned to write? How often did you do that? What were they? And like, have you ever drawn a picture? Like, how often did you draw pictures during your childhood? Like, how long did that last? Like, were they pictures that people told you to draw? And I think like, if I could get some kind of like portfolio like that, like, I think you might be able to see that there's a personality style or trait just inclined towards exploration. I think it's very important that you're not driven by what other people told you to do in some sense. It's unfortunate that like the culture actually like tries to make you do things that other people tell you to do. So like this can be drowned out by that noise. Like you might be like that as a person, but like as soon as you got into kindergarten, now or the earliest grade, wherever you're from, like now, you start being acculturated to just follow directions because that's what you're rewarded for. So now it's a little noisier. It's harder for me to actually see that signal. But I would hope maybe like the most kind of willing to follow the interesting would have somehow found a way around that. Like maybe at home they still did their thing, even though at school they're doing a bunch of boring nonsense. And so, I don't mean actually to totally dismiss like doing boring nonsense. Like you do need that, like to learn things. It's not like we should not have any kind of instruction, but it's just that that's not going to help us detect those kinds of people is the problem. And so I think like that, yeah, we could, if we could get portfolios like that, I would love to just start a college where that's how you get in. You send in your portfolio from age like 3 to 18 or something of just stuff you've done yourself and some sort of motivation, like why did you do these things? And so we kind of find that explorer characteristic maybe.
I love that. So we danced around it, I guess, a little bit with a lot of these questions, but like no matter who you are, you're like nested within a bunch of social structures, right? Like you have your individual, you have your family, you have your company, you have, on and on and on. And it's one thing to adopt this for yourself, right? I'm going to follow what's interesting to me, and that's exciting. But almost always you have someone to report to, right? You have a team around you. And even just telling your family, I don't really know what I'm working on, but I think it's interesting. Like it's socially awkward, or at least it would feel so to me in a lot of ways. So with like that setup, Ken, like how do you think about like there's individual change, but then there's social change, there's organizational change. How on earth do we start embedding some semblance of like this thinking at the right time? Like, I would guess it starts at the individual, but yeah, how do we build structures that allow, whether you're a VC or a boss, Google's 20% time sort of comes up, but maybe that's a stupid idea. But like, anyway, talk to us a little bit about that, like social organizational change and how this might find its way into it.
What you said about the awkwardness is totally true. I mean, that was one of the reasons that the artists responded so strongly, because they did feel that this was, socially, it's just a very awkward thing to explain to your parents and things like that. And I think this does just pervade culture, that it's something that, like the idea of doing things because they're interesting is not something that's really respected in general, up and down, like all hierarchies that we have, like institutionally. So this is now getting away from just personal. Institutionally, this is like a serious problem, I think, that like if you, for example, apply, and I know a lot about because I was a professor for 10 years. So like if you apply for a grant, which is like you're saying basically, I want money to be able to pursue this research project. And usually like if you're in research university, like you do that by asking some agency In the United States, it'd be like the National Science Foundation or something like that for some money, basically say, I want to do this thing. And what they want is basically objectives. They want to know, like, what are you going to accomplish? How are you going to measure progress? How are you going to confirm that you're making progress? Like, they want to know all this stuff, which is totally contrary to what I'm saying. And so this is like one of the worst places for this, because this is definitively a place which is supposed to be fostering innovation. Like I could understand if it's like, this is like a restaurant and we're trying to like get all our orders out, but this is the NSF. Like, we're actually trying to foster innovation. And so like I think it's just a reflection of the fact that it's absolutely pervasive across culture and across institutions, even the institutions whose job it is to foster innovation, which includes companies, which includes like a lot of companies have a little area of the company that's supposed to be like where like innovation happens, or they have like a little lab or something. Like, they work very objectively, generally speaking, all across. And so this was actually a big motivation for writing the book. Like what the question you asked, like it really was about the fact that I perceived, and my co-author, Joel Lehman, also perceived that, once we have this kind of revelation that like this doesn't work, even though it seems like intuitively, most people think at first like, oh, well, having an objective is helpful. But once you realize it's actually not helpful, then the next thing is like, but like the whole society runs that way. Like, what the hell does that even mean? Like, I was trying to absorb, like, what does this actually mean that everything runs this way and it doesn't even make sense? And I started to conclude that like there has to be social change. You have to do something about this, to change the fact that like we run things in a way that it's like a complete delusion. It's a security blanket, but it's not true. And so we decided, Joel and I, that like maybe like the first answer to the question you're asking was, we need to get the conversation started. That was like answer number one. Like the initial problem is there's no conversation, which I find really interesting. Like, there's not like an anti-objective movement. Like, have you heard of that? Like, are there protesters on the street? Like, there's nobody cares about this one way or another. It's so status quo that like there's not even any controversy about it. And that's like unusual for something where I think it merits some degree of controversy. And so we thought like we got to at least start a conversation. So that's why we decided to write the book, was so that there would be conversations like the one we're having right now, which is why I'm really happy to be in this conversation, because it's like totally was like what the book was for, is to provoke this kind of discussion and have a chance to spread, at least like that's step one, right? Like, because people should at least see that there's two sides to the issue and like think about it. Like, what should we do about it? And then beyond that, though, there's like, what should we actually do? What should we do to affect institutional change in our culture? And this pervades like everything back to the point where you start like kindergarten. Like I said, like think about how objective like school is. Like, that's also messed up. Like, there should be some amount of rewarding of exploration, which is just intrinsic to human nature from like the moment you're born, which is then just like completely sucked out of you because of the way like the institutional structure works. It's all totally objective. And by the way, like problems like the fact that we can't get kids to perform well in school and stuff like that, the solution to that, because it's very ambitious, like if you want every student in the United States to score 100 on every test, that's an extremely ambitious goal. It will also be subject to the paradox of objectives, or what I call the myth of the objective. It will not be achieved through objective means, because we need to collect stepping stones that don't look like everybody scoring 100. If we want to get to people scoring 100, that's the only thing I know about how to do it. And yet that's exactly the opposite of what we're doing, because basically assessment just pervades everything. So now we're gonna have assessment for the schools, for the students, every few months, every year. It's just everything is about assessment objectively along this like prescribed path. And so to get away from this, I think the answer is that at one level there should be some like public discussion. There should be a discussion like this, but hopefully it will move to a higher level of discussion where like it's like big forums with many people aware of it. And then the other part of it is like within the institutions themselves, people have to push for the change, I think. And that's obviously difficult. Like I think like you think of like, okay, I run a lab at a company or something like that. And we've been tasked with like being innovative. Like we're supposed to like, prevent disruption of what we do, and we're also anticipate the future so that we don't miss out on some opportunities. So that's my job. And so in theory, like I should be doing this, like following interestingness, collecting stepping stones, like that's what we should be doing. But like the problem is that I answer to other people. I answer to someone else at the company. So it's probably some high level executive. So if I'm running the innovation, I'm answering to some executive somewhere near to the CEO. And so now they are thinking in terms of like objectives. I mean, they're like, okay, you're running the innovation lab, but we would like to see how that's impacting the larger company. We're not just paying you to have fun after all, right? Like you guys have a little fun for the next few months, but then come back to us with some objective metrics. And so now here's where the problem happens, right? Like the person may be totally bought in, like maybe they read the book. I mean, ideally they read our book. So they're like, oh, I totally buy all this philosophy, but they've got this boss who doesn't know anything about this and doesn't care and wants to know what's the reassurance and the security blanket that they're not just blowing money. And I can understand. I mean, I can empathize and relate to the idea that like innovation lab is like a super expensive thing, right? Like you're paying like top level people like tons and tons, like high salaries over years. And what the heck is the point? Why am I doing this? So of course I would like reassurance, but the problem is that it's just reality must be accepted. It doesn't work. You know, you cannot cause people to be innovative by forcing them to report back metrics every month. And so it will just be antithetical to innovation. And of course, we'll end up destroying the innovation lab. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen at companies. I've been in industry now for a while. It literally happens. It's the same thing like NSF, like they report ultimately, who does the NSF report to? They report to the government. They report to like the Senate, you know, like the actual, like the people in power who've been elected officials. Like those people want to see what is the point of having NSF? We're spending taxpayer money. Can you show me the metrics? Like, and so NSF's like scrambling to come up with metrics that show that this research has impact. And that's why the researchers have to tell you what the impact's going to be before they get the money. And so it's all totally upside down. It's the problem is reporting through these hierarchies. How can we buck this trend? Like, I think like the answer is that at the mid-level, like if you are reporting to someone, which is almost everybody's reporting to someone, then you're going to have to like explain it. And that's another reason we wrote the book. Like the book is supposed to be a weapon so that you can actually fight. It gives a lot of objective scientific advice. I don't mean objective in the sense of following objective. I mean, like we've actually done experiments to try to bolster the argument so that you could have an argument that's plausible with somebody if you really wanted to and convince them. And it's not impossible. Like I've gone to gatekeepers with this and I've had discussions with them and they have said that this changed their thinking. But again, they usually answer to somebody is the problem. They're like, yeah, I mean, I talked to somebody, he was almost $1 billion of research money that this guy was controlling. And he said, you know, like we need to reorganize, like, how should we do it? He really wanted to talk, but, you know, I do answer to this, you know, higher person. And so is anything going to happen? I don't know. I suspect not much is going to actually happen. It's just exciting, but I don't know what to do. So a real fight has to happen, I think. And it's really hard because if you think about it, it's so easy to not care about this because it's just so, it's so intellectual. It's like out there. It's not like, you know, we're not talking about abortion here. And we're talking about like, if you have an objective and it's just like, am I really going to fight about this? Like with all the controversy in the world, it's just really hard to get this going, but I think we should try.
A couple of things sparked in me there, Ken, where kind of this idea that your business model it takes on the business model of your capital provider, right? So if you have someone that needs to, you know, return a certain amount of money in 3 years, like you're going to be on that timeline too, whether you like it or not. Yeah. And it also strikes me like if the collective, we are able to do something like this, it's so hard that it feels like this enormous advantage, right? Like it's going to be hard enough to get it up and going once, right? With the right capital, with the right group, with the right sponsors, et cetera, that having anybody replicate that feels extraordinarily difficult, which is the pain and also the opportunity, I guess. Ken, Richard Hurd, who was the one who originally introduced us, has a question. So I'd love to turn it over to him really quickly.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate you doing this, and Bloss, thank you. Ken, you know I love your book. And my couple questions. One, have you and Nassim Taleb ever got together and compared notes and thoughts and ideas?
No, I've never had any interaction with him at all.
Yeah, well, the reason I ask is your work made me think of a couple of his books, and an alternative title to your book could be The White Swan, because he wrote a book called The Black Swan, which was all about looking for these random negative events, right, and getting prepared for them. And I much prefer your book. Would much rather go find a white swan than a black swan any day of the week. And I didn't know if you had compared your thoughts on randomness, because they do intersect, right? He's looking at it more from a risk management perspective, and you're looking at it from a opportunity creation perspective. And the second is just more of an observation. This reading your book caused me to reread Fooled by Randomness, which is a litany of case studies of people who become so focused on an objective, they destroy their career. They're so focused on, in this case, usually financial trading. And there's all these novel things happening around them. There's stepping stones all around them, and they're ignoring them because they're so focused on the objective, and they end up blowing up their career. So I didn't know if you had read that and had anything to add to that or comment about that, but it did make me think about it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great comments. I like that white swan point. Actually, maybe that would have been maybe a better marketing angle for the book, to be the white swan opposed to the black swan. I would love to talk to Taleb. I've never, and I think we would have a very interesting conversation, I imagine. I don't know he knows anything about me either, but yeah, I see the connection there, and it's a pretty interesting connection, and I wonder what he would think about all this. The second point, actually, yeah, could you just remind me of that second point there? Oops, you muted.
The second point was fooled by randomness, right?
Oh, right,
I mean, these are people who become so objectively focused, events that they're not even considering that are happening right before their eyes.
Yeah.
Blow up their careers, right? It really is, proves your point even more. Not that it needed additional proof, but becoming so objective focused is blinded these people to, and I say these people, shoot, I've done it myself a million times. It's not like I'm any different, right?
Yeah.
That was more the point.
Got it. Yeah. It's a great connection. Actually, yeah, I haven't read that, but I appreciate the connection there. It sounds like a great story, of sort of like the dangers. This is the thing that's not talked about as much, is just like, we're also worried about the dangers of not having an objective metric. Like this, like what might happen, bad things could happen, is really scary. But what about the dangers of having an objective? Like there's a lot of bad things that can happen on the other side too, which is like,
that's what his book is about.
Right.
Exactly.
So I think it's definitely relevant, and it tells a good cautionary tale on the other side.
And so one thing we focus a lot in this community, and I guess the way I try to judge success in one small way, is like, integration of these ideas is really difficult, right? It's one thing to understand it theoretically, and that makes sense, and we nod our heads, and this is great. But it's hard to kind of figure out how you implement this in your own life. And whether it's something you've changed, a behavior, a way you approach problems or opportunities, or what you've seen other people do. If you have any sort of like concrete examples of this in action, just to drive the point home, I think it'd be really helpful.
Yeah. So just we should also make a distinction that there's maybe advice or suggestions here about institutional change, and then there's sort of implications for your own life. And I think both of them kind of deserve some attention. And so now I'm going to focus on your life, like, because institutionally, I think it's actually maybe even could be easier to talk about, because we can see like some serious flaws, like what's going on institutionally. Your life is maybe a little harder to talk about because it's so subjective and personal. But I think like the main thing is that you need to start out by deciding what your risk tolerance is. Because at a personal level, like if it's not institutional, then like what I'm saying means that, you have an opportunity to maybe achieve some really remarkable things in your life if you're willing to kind of follow interestingness. But the trade-off is that like you might fail And it is like a much less kind of guaranteed route than just like, okay, I went to college, I majored in accounting and I became an accountant. Like, I'm not saying it's bad at all. Like, that's something that we know how to do. And it's a path that's already been prescribed. And so like, you first, like, you don't have to do this, it's personal. And if you just want to have a comfortable existence, there's lots of things you can do without trying to follow this. So, but if you really want to sort of like say, well, but I want to have discovery in my life, like I want to explore, maybe it's not just about professional also. I think there are other aspects of life, which is like personal fulfillment, even cliche. I mean, love is a funny thing because like there are a lot of quotes about love that basically sound like they came out of the book if you just take the word love out of it. It's like, the best way to find love is to stop trying to find it or something like that. It's like exactly the advice here. And so, just pursue relationships that are interesting. Like, don't worry about it. And so I think at some levels, like almost everybody wants to pursue that. So certainly that is advice you can follow. Be open to opportunities. Like, don't worry so much, is it going to succeed at some particular threshold that you're concerned with? But in things that are like more like professional, then you're getting into risks where there are alternatives that are less risky, so it can be troubling. But with love, you don't have much of an alternative. I think, like, you can't just find a path that's like defined for you to make that happen. But something like making a lot of money is also, like, making a lot of money is a good example, actually. Like I mean, if you're talking like $1 billion, like, it's completely different than like, I want to make $100,000 a year. Like, I want to make $100,000 a year, I think, can be pursued objectively. It's pretty clear. There's a lot of stepping stones that have already been defined and laid out for you. There are many more than one option. So it's not like the one that's good for you is necessarily the one for me, but you can still probably identify ones that are reasonable and realistic. But okay, I want to make $1 billion. I mean, there are no stepping stones laid out for that. Who knows what it is? And so like, the way to get to making $1 billion is almost certainly not trying to make $1 billion. And so what should you be doing is, you should be doing things that are interesting to you. And so like, one thing you could do is, well, I could try to maximize my salary. Like, I'm not going to take the unpaid internship. If it's like, how am I going to get to be a billionaire with an unpaid internship? But of course, that's like a ridiculous position. Like, it's actually what you probably should be doing, because it's actually interesting. And it's almost certainly like the path of interestingness will be the only path that can lead to billions. But you have to remember again, that the path of interestingness is not a path to a particular thing. So there's absolutely no reassurance that doing something interesting will lead to $1 billion. It will lead to something, is the point. Something remarkable, if you're lucky. But certainly we have no idea whether $1 billion is the thing at the end of that. But the other side of it is, if you did get to $1 billion, it's probably because you weren't being objective at some point. So at some point you did follow the path of interestingness. And you can see this in the biographies of all billionaires, like Steve Jobs or something. Is like, he says things like this all the time. He took this like calligraphy class. He dropped out of college so he could sit in a calligraphy class and just like hang out. Well, what's the point of going into calligraphy class? Like, what the heck are you doing with your future there? But then like, that led to the whole font thing on the Mac and everything. And the Mac became very distinct because of that. And so like, there's story after story after story like this of people like that, like willing to take risks, because that's pretty scary. I mean, I would never drop out of college and sit in, I can't imagine myself being that brave. I don't know what kind of mindset that is. But that's like the kind of thing that leads to really interesting stuff. Just do stuff that's interesting. Like, why was he so passionately interested in calligraphy? I have no idea. Wasn't that interesting to me? I kind of like fonts though, but not that much. So it's like, this is like what you have to be willing to do. And it's your interestingness meter that actually matters. It's because it's personal to you. So like, what he would have liked is that you cannot follow someone else's meter, because they'll do it better than you and you're not as sensitive. And it's the details that matter. It's the richness. It's not it's not like the macro level big picture. It's the little parts that really make you unique and your sense of interestingness. And that just cannot be reproduced from someone else. So that's why advice is not that helpful on this kind of stuff. It's like, read every biography you want of every famous person. Like, you can't just follow their template. Like, you have to do what's interesting to you. And so that is hard to implement, but I think there's some principles there. Like, for example, keep a repertoire around. Like, don't just have one thing, because it's just much more risky. Like, you can do that, but you will probably go to disappointment and then you'll hate it. You'll hate the philosophy and you'll sue me or something for telling you, like, because you'll end up impoverished and on the street or something. Like, that's not a good strategy. So try to find a way to like have more than one ball in the air at the same time that are interesting. and ideally get into a profession that allows you to do that, so you're not going bankrupt. I mean, these are kind of practical things, but like, I was a professor. That's a great profession. I'm not saying everybody here should become a professor, but like, it's one option. Like, it was one thing where, I can have several research projects. Like, if one fails, well, that's okay. Like, other ones succeeded. It's like having a portfolio of investments. Like, you want to be in a position where that's actually professionally expected, rather than like extremely risky to your whole livelihood, and your family's going to go broke. And so a little thinking about that, which is practical, I think can be useful. And it might mean there's some delayed gratification. Like, as you get yourself into a position where that's actually more realistic, it might take some years of something like to get into that position. And there are rebellious type people who, like, starting at age 15, just do whatever the hell they want. Most of them are like, in trouble by the time they're like 25. Like, that doesn't usually work. Once in a while it works great, of course, because like, it's always somebody who is willing to just follow the interestingness, who does the amazing thing. That's always the case. But of course, most people like that will just end up at a dead end. And interestingness is not a guarantee of anything. And so, like, you can be that way and just be like, screw it, I'm just gonna do whatever I want. But you have to understand you're probably not gonna be too happy a few years later. So there are ways, I think, to integrate this into your personal lifestyle. But you have to be realistic and understand what the trade-offs are, as with all risk. I think risk is something people should be allowed to do as long as they understand the risks that they're getting into. A lot of time I hear people complain about things that they did that led to less than they hoped they would. And those complaints often feel a little hollow to me if it's something where they should have understood the risk. Like, the complaint is generally like, it's like a lot of people complain about like going to higher education or something because like a lot of people can't get into higher ed because it's super competitive. Well, I mean, you probably, like, I would go into it, but understanding I probably won't get into it. Like, if you thought that there's some guarantee, like, that's actually like, you were not assessing risk realistically. I'm not saying I don't feel sorry, like if somebody was misled or something, but like, assessing risk is really the first thing. And then, if you feel like it's okay to take the risk, you want to become a movie star, so you move to Hollywood, I think it's fine as long as you understand you're probably not going to be a movie star, but you're willing to take that risk.
Super helpful, Ken. Another book that had a great impression on me is Robert Fritz's The Path of Least Resistance. And the image I walked away from that book is like, straight line is often not the most direct route to something, right? It's often like a spiral, right? Kind of the way he talks about it, or at least the impression I got from it. And anyway, we're at the top of the hour, Ken, and I want to make sure, what we have a really interesting community here, all sorts of backgrounds, all geographies. How can we collectively help you? Is it spreading the word? Is it just instituting this in our lives? Like, what is top of mind for you, and how might we be able to be useful to you in some way?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I mean, spreading the word is clearly useful. I sometimes wonder like how viral this idea is. I still don't know after years, like exactly like what, like if there had been a marketing team behind it or something, like would the whole world know about this? Or is it kind of just limited to certain kind of like intellectual type of person or something? Like what kind of person? Because I feel like it just should be going all over the place. Like every time I experience people's reactions, it's just overwhelmingly positive. I actually thought that like when I wrote it, I thought it'd be controversial. That's what I was expecting. Like half the people would be like, this is garbage, like objectives are super important. Because it seems like everybody's invested in objectives. Like there's all these gatekeepers everywhere. I thought they'd all be angry. But that's not what I get. Like it was not what I expected, but I found that the gatekeepers are usually feeling better after reading the book. They're like, I hate my job. Like, I don't like what I'm doing. It's like, it seems to speak to something in human nature that's true. There is, of course, some small percentage that don't like it. There's always going to be that. But that makes me wonder why then is it not spreading more? And so anything that could help to get the word out, like, I don't care if people read the book, it's more the message, like to get people to be aware, especially at the institutional level, like, because that's really what I wanted to battle. But I think at the personal level, it seems to also resonate and be helpful. So it's definitely like, how can I get the message out? Anything to get the message out is great for this, I think. And I wasn't trying to make money by writing the book. The book doesn't make me much money at all. So it's really, I was just really interested in getting this message out, and trying to do that. Other than that, I would experiment with institutional change if you are a gatekeeper. That's really hard. I recognize that. And so I'm really interested in actual attempts to do that. I don't think there are a lot. Like, although there's a lot of people who I know have read the book and have expressed like, kind of deep interest in what its message says, they don't necessarily really wreck the culture where they are. And it's just interesting if somebody would have the courage to do that, what the story would be, what would that actually look like? I know there's some very exceptional cases where somebody like modeled their company after the book or something. It was usually very small startups or something like that. There's nothing like really big success stories like that. So that'd be very interesting. And let's see, what else could be helpful is if you let me keep in touch, I guess, like, maybe things will, as I try to, get this idea more accepted and maybe have more success, then maybe I would want to touch base and have more ideas for you.
Ken, that sounds great. Thank you so much for your time, for the book, for your perspectives. Everyone who stayed on a few minutes later, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Ken, and in that vein, if you're open to it, we can share your email with this small group, right? Not super broadly. We don't want to flood you or anything like that, but building up case studies, seeing how people are using it in their lives, I can imagine that would be interesting. So maybe we do that as a next step here.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great. Please do.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. This is great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was awesome.